Welcome to the Grizzly Times podcast with Louisa Wilcox, a place devoted to all things grizzly, where we interview scientists, managers, Native Americans, and others about their perspectives and experience with bears and their ecosystems. This comes at a critical time in a complex debate about grizzly bears, with the recent restoration of endangered species safeguards for the Yellowstone bear, but a new proposal to strip protections for Glacier's grizzlies, and when warming temperatures and development are transforming the bear's world. We hope that you find the information and views offered here useful as you shape your own conclusions. This is Louisa Wilcox with Grizzly Times, and I'm delighted to be here today with Lou Bruno. Lou is a teacher, naturalist, and advocate for wild places with a special love for the Badger Two Medicine country next to Glacier National Park. The Badger Two Medicine lies in the heart of grizzly bear habitat and has been called the backbone of the world by the Blackfeet. But it's threatened by energy development and rampant off-road vehicle use. 35 years ago, Lou started the Glacier Two Medicine Alliance to advocate for the protection of the badger, and their group has proven remarkably effective at a difficult time for conservation. Lou, thanks for being here today.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to do
you're
it.
Celebrating a major victory in your 35-year campaign to save the badger with a recent announcement that oil and gas leases in the heart of the wild will be permanently retired. Why is that win so important?
Well, it's important because as long as those leases exist, we just have to keep basically putting out spot fires, on a case-by-case basis. In fact, one of them does still exist, the original one that started our group in the first place, still is there. The government is still supposedly committed to upholding their ability to cancel it, but in these times, we don't know how strong that commitment is,
Right.
We have our doubts. So, so it's definitely a victory to have there are only two of them left, and the one was just bought out. But we still have the other one, and we are hopeful that we can get a good ruling on that and get it put to bed for good, and then we work on permanent protection.
Right. We'll get back to that in a bit.
Yeah.
So, Lou, you hail from New York City, which is about as far as you can get from the wilds of the Rocky Mountains front.
That's definitely true.
How did you find your way there?
Well, it was basically an accident. I came out to major in wildlife biology at the U of M in 1965, and when I first laid eyes on the front, I was on a field trip the next spring to the Sun River Game Range and Freeze Out Lake, and I had this magical experience on the game range. I was in those days there was a bunkhouse for work crew, and staff and that, and our class stayed in the bunkhouse, and of course, in the middle of the night, I had to get up and pee, and it was a full moon, and I walked out of the bunkhouse, and there on the far slopes was a herd of elk, probably 20 or 30 elk, and in the full moonlight, and I think that was when the first the front started weaving its spell on me, but at the time I never thought that, and all that day, I remember it feeling like the plains of Africa, because there were huge herds of mule deer, 40, 50, 60 herds of mule deer, 40, 50, 60 head of mule deer in each herd, and elk, and I'd seen all this stuff, and I was a new kid from New York, and then we went to Freeze Out, and saw the snow geese, and everything conspired to make me fall in love with the place. But I never thought at the time that it was really a livable place, that it was any place that people should live at, because it was so severe, And where do I wind up a few years later? Probably the most severest part of the front,
Right.
And that was mainly because I needed a job. I was in Big Fork the year before. That was really in those days. That was where I wanted to be. Out of the wind and in the big timber, and I still have an affinity for that. But I basically moved here for the job, and I felt like I was being exiled to Siberia. It was cold and harsh as it is today. Wind's blowing again. Big surprise. And so I just wound up here, and then again it conspired. It started leaving its spell on me, like I said in my in the thing I wrote up, people would ask me, how do you drive that road every day? And people that weren't from here, to go to school and come back from school, and I had no idea what I would see, I was often driving home at 4:30 after school, between 4 and 4:30, and the sun would be setting behind the mountains and lighting up the snow that was blowing off the peaks and putting alpenglow up in the clouds, and it's just magical when it's like that. It's extremely harsh, but it's incredibly magical. And sometimes the whole prairie would be suffused in that alpenglow, and snow was blowing across the road, and the prairie was in constant movement because the drifts were blowing across the prairie.
Mm-hmm.
It's I don't know. It's like, and when you start seeing that and getting used to that, you miss it when you're away from it. Almost,
Mm-hmm.
It's weird. So it's hard to explain, But I always say, it reminds me of and believe me, I've never been a drug addict, but it reminds me of being on crack, because it's so good when it's good, and it's so magical to see those things that are missing when I go to Missoula, that I miss it when I'm away from it, And I wonder, like, what am I missing? Like, when am I missing those times when the snow is blowing off the peaks and being lit up like that in that light, or when I'm missing a really good sunny day on the front, So anyway, that's how I wound up here. So
you describe a night 35 years ago when a friend inspired you to attend a meeting with the Forest Service on oil and gas leasing along the Rocky Mountain front. And you say that your notion of public lands management about protecting the public trust was shattered.
Yeah.
Can you share what happened and what you did in response?
Yeah. Well, it was in November, and I think as I'm remembering, it was Thanksgiving week, and and so somebody knocked on my door, a person that lives out that has some land out there on the edge of the Badger, and asked to use my telephone because she didn't have a phone where she lived. It was before the days of cell phones, of course, and she told me that there was a meeting at the community hall where they were taking public comment about this application for a permit to drill, and I didn't know much about it except that the previous summer we had been subjected to hearing all of these blasts and helicopters flying back and forth because they were doing all this seismic work back in there, and they were staying in town at some of the motels, and flying in and out of these motels, and so I thought, well, and she wanted to use my phone so that she could call people because they advertised it very poorly. I had no idea about it, and neither did anybody else, and also the majority of the teachers were gone because they were gone for Thanksgiving, So it was a really poor time, and the weather was terrible. So it was a really poor time to get public comment. So I was kind of dubious at first, anyway, And then I went to this meeting, and Chuck Jonkel was there, and I had met Chuck a few times because he's been up on the reservation. He had been up on the reservation trying to basically, foster conservation on the reservation and worked with a grizzly bear and stuff like that. And also Bill Cunningham was there, I think, and from MWA. And
Montana Wilderness Association.
Yes. And so from while that was all going on, they were telling us things like the decision hadn't been made yet, and they weren't really committed to it yet. They were just getting public comment. They were acting like they were basically just doing it as the goodness of their heart, never mind that they were supposed to do it, And they were telling us these things, and meanwhile Chuck was whispering in my ear and going, "No, they're lying," and so was Bill Cunningham. And by the time the meeting was over, we were so angry at them, and I was, before that, I was one of those people that used the woods, I've always been oriented towards the woods, even though I grew up in the city. I moved out here because I saw every little speck of a natural country I knew totally destroyed, and I didn't want to have to see that again,
Mm-hmm.
And so I basically thought, I saw the clear cuts and some of the decisions around Missoula, and Kalispell, and I thought, well, who am I to question their management abilities? They have the public trust to manage those lands, and they probably know what they're doing. And so I basically gave them all a pass. And then when I found out that they were not following their mandate, obviously, and I always quote this, their mandate says, for the greatest good for the most people for the longest period of time,
Mm-hmm.
And so their mandate is to manage these lands wisely for the public, and they're messing up, and I could use stronger language, and it made me very, very angry, I felt very violated, and, because I do, like I've told you before, I do believe that they're right now anyway, it's still a democracy in this country, and that democracy does work if people make it work for them. But the problem is that a lot of people don't believe that there is a democracy and that they can't do anything, And I feel like when you adopt that attitude, then you're dead in the water at the very start. If you believe that you can't affect change or make any difference, then you never will,
Yeah, so you obviously did try to take things into your own hands and make democracy work in forming the Glacier Two Medicine Alliance.
I did.
And you described that it was a magical time. What made it so?
Oh, well, shortly after that meeting, the MWA had their annual gathering. I think it was always the first week of December, and in different cities. And I think that time it was either in Butte or Helena. It had to have been, because I remember going down in that direction. And so, Bill urged me to go to an MWA convention, and I think the Sedlacks were there at that meeting too, maybe Art or maybe Elaine or both, at the meeting in East Glacier. And and Chuck and the Sedlacks were planning to be there, and they said, if you go to this meeting, I'll introduce you to some people that maybe can help you, because we had not a clue about how to form a group, what we could do about it. All we knew was that we needed to do something. Our backs were against the wall, And I walked into MWA, and that first day, I didn't know a soul because Chuck wasn't there. It was the time when there was some strife with Bill, and they fired him as their as their employee, you know. So there was a lot of bad blood between him and MWA at the time, and so he wasn't there. The Sedlacks weren't there, and Chuck wasn't there until the next day. And that first day, there I was, plunked in the middle of 300-something people that I didn't know, and I had no idea who to talk to or how to start up a conversation with all of these people I had no clue about. But I remember sitting in the back row and watching, I think Doris Milner and Bill Bishop were both, and possibly Phil Tawney were basically officiating at the convention, and I was so blown away by them and the other people I saw, and I remember, the Brass Cup Awards, and thinking, God, how would it be to be involved in something so noble as advocacy for the land and to be recognized for it, never dreaming that it would happen to me, and I just sat, and that's what I meant about the glory days, because those were the days when all the luminaries were still alive, the Baldwins and Posowitz was very active too, and all of the big names, that justifiably so, the big names in the wilderness movement of this state and the environmental movement, and the more people I met, the more I was just blown away by them, and the ironic thing was that when they came to know me, they changed my life because they recognized skills that I had that I didn't know I had, and in fact, and to the point where it's like they embraced me and my issue so strongly that 2 years later I was vice president of that organization, and the next year I was president. That's how I went from not knowing a soul to, and then see what happened too was the next day. Then Chuck showed up, and the Sedlacks showed up, and they introduced me to people, and everybody had some way they could help me. John Frederick was there from the North Fork Preservation Association, and he loaned me their Constitution and bylaws because they had just started up a year or two beforehand. And so we applied for his 501c3 status. We had help doing that. Chuck introduced me to Jasper Carlton. I don't know if you remember him.
Yeah.
But he coached me about how to write a letter to the Forest Service, a letter of concern, and other people taught me how to write to congressmen and representatives. It was all something that I had absolutely no knowledge of, and nobody else did either in the group, And
so you mentioned Chuck Dongle several times, and obviously, he was a giant of grizzly bear research and conservation. But Chuck and John Craighead and John Weaver, grizzly bear experts for whom grizzlies really define not only the wilderness but the whole northern continental divide ecosystem and the front. Maybe you can share a bit about your connection to grizzlies and perhaps a bit more about how these scientists may have influenced your work.
Yeah. Well, my dream was always to be a wildlife biologist, and I had to give up that dream because during those times, in the 60s, it was really hard to get a job. They were focusing more on women and minorities, and my grades weren't as good as they could have been, and so in the middle of my senior year, I gave it up, But I was always attracted to people that were involved in those issues, and the grizzly, to me, I feel about the grizzly the way I do about birding too, is that they're not the end all and be all, but they're an integral part of this ecosystem, and I'm also just as interested in plants and birds and other things,
Right.
But the grizzly as the keystone species, of course, has an extreme important role, and I love the fact that they're here, and that I live in country where I could walk down the road and run into one. I've never seen one actually right here, and I've seen tracks in my driveway. I just found tracks a couple of weeks ago. But it also, all of us here kind of look disdainfully at the people farther south on the front, or the people farther out on the prairie that are saying they're under siege because there are grizzlies around, and we're going, come on, give me a break. They're here, but they're not waiting behind every tree to pounce on you or your children, So, we live with them every day. We take precautions thanks to the tribe and Dan Carney. We know the precautions we need to take with our bird feeders and our compost and things like that, we just know, and we're glad to do it as long as everyone I know is glad to do it, as far as my neighbors here, just because we like the fact that we live in grizzly country, and we appreciate the fact that they're here, and there are and I feel like, what? If you don't like it, there's 99.9% of the rest of the country that you could live in without grizzlies,
So you mentioned the tribes a moment ago, and the tribes were central to a powerful coalition that you helped to develop with ranchers and sportsmen and conservationists and others who have persevered with this campaign to protect the badger for so long.
Yeah.
And the coalition is seen by many as a model for how conservation can and should be done. Maybe you can share a bit about what it's like with such a diverse group of people and why you think the campaign serves as a model for other advocates.
Well, I think, our advantage here is that we're local, and we all work in the community, like Kendall Flint, our previous president, was an OBGYN at the hospital and has delivered a gazillion babies, and I taught in the community, in the Browning community, for 20 years. Lots of those kids are now, that I had as 4th or 5th graders, are now at least middle-aged. I keep telling them you could at least have been grown up. You don't have to be middle-aged, to make me feel old, But anyway, I think through those years, as a result of that, you wind up building a trust with some of them, and they respect you for the work you've done in the community, and with them personally, So I think that helps us a lot. And, sometimes we don't see eye to eye about certain things, but we can, I'm not going to say we what's the word, compromise, and we don't do the kinds of things MWA does with collaboration, where we give up the certain lands that we think are important, but
right.
But and we've had a lot to put up with in our dealings with the Blackfeet, because at times they haven't seen eye to eye with us over certain things, there was a time when they did not have a game code or a game season, and anything that came out of the park was shot, and things have changed remarkably since then. And and now they're talking a reservation-wide land use plan, possibly Blackfeet Park along the foothills of Glacier. They're talking about free-roaming bison, retiring the cattle leases they have in the foothills, and reestablishing a free-roaming bison herd that wanders in and out of Glacier and the Badger Two Med and the reservation. So, all of those are really, really exciting things, that, I always say this country, as opposed to a lot of the rest of the country, is on the upbeat and on the upswing as far as environment, because it's had previous abuses, and those abuses are like previous abuses, like a lot of ATVing, and that's pretty much gone now. Although there's people violating it, they're just violating it. It's not like it's gone. It's crazy like it used to be,
Right.
So, and the cattle leases are still there. The cattle are grazing in the foothills and pretty heavily, but we're hoping that eventually is a thing of the past too, So, yeah. So.
Well, in the course of your work, you describe a high point in Choteau, Montana, on the front.
Oh, yeah.
2015 meeting when the National Historic Preservation Council, which has authority over culturally important places like the Badger, heard testimony on what people thought about oil and gas development. Maybe you can describe what happened there and how that night changed the course of your work.
Yeah. Well, that meeting typified to me what inspired me, one of the things that inspired me about MWA years ago, and that was that the people that came, there were, I'm terrible with numbers, but I think there were 70-something people that testified that day and at that meeting, and they were from every walk of life you could possibly imagine on the front, in Montana. And that was the way MWA was at the time, It was like they weren't just a bunch of granolas. They were ranchers, teachers, doctors, every profession you could possibly think of. And that's the way it was at that meeting, And the meeting reminded me of what inspired me about the very first convention that I went to in Helena and Butte, and that is that, constantly people would get up one after the other and from their point of view talk about how important it was to keep the Badger wild and to keep oil and gas development out. And these were Native Americans, they were veterans, they were farmers and ranchers, they were conservationists, everyone you could think of, And when you look at that broad spectrum of Montana society, all having the same value system as you do, it's pretty powerful. Like I spent 25 years going to every single MWA convention every year because it was to me like my one time a year, my one weekend a year where I could go to a different planet where everybody had my value system, So. And that's what this was all about. Out of those 70-something people that testified, the only person that was pro-oil and gas was the lawyer for Solonex. There was, continually somebody would get up there that looked redneck, with a cowboy hat, or some old lady with a moo-moo or whatever, and I'm going, these people they're definitely going to be pro-oil and gas, and they never were. They all had their own take on it, and they were all pro-environment, keeping the front the way it is. So it was very inspirational.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you think that the work that you've been doing up there has brought out voices for existing values, or do you think the values themselves are changing?
I think the values exist here. I've always said that about the Blackfeet, that if you went to Choteau and did a poll about wanting and asked people if they wanted the land to stay in its current status, I think you would get many more people on the Blackfeet Reservation that would say yes rather than the people in Choteau, And because I think it's, despite the fact that that they've diversified, and that the population's diversified, it's still deep down part of their culture, a lot of people have different takes on it. Some of them feel that the Blackfeet still own the badger. Some of them feel that they should have co-management. Some feel like they should have complete management of it. There's all different diverse feel, and some feel like they want it developed for oil and gas. And the thing that frustrates me is that racism rears its head in a lot of strange ways, and one way is when people look at the Blackfeet and say, well, they're all environmentalists, so they all have this connection with the land, and they're all pro-conservation, and that's not honoring their diversity as a people, It's just like calling them all drunks or all child molesters or all good for nothings. You can't take any population and say they're all this or that. It's not being fair to their diversity. So anyway, but I do feel that feeling has been there, even with people that poached or broke the law. As far as game management, the feelings, the connection has always been there, So with a lot of people, I'm not saying everybody, but it just runs a whole different. It just runs the whole spectrum, just as it does with white folks, So.
Yeah. Well, you've obviously gotten a few steps closer to your vision for full protection for the badger with the decision by Moncrief Oil to essentially retire their leases. And, of course, that leaves the problematic company Solonex, which so far has been resisting the same. Are you optimistic that you will prevail with this last holdout? And what are your thoughts now about full protection for the badger?
I firmly believe that we will prevail because, the case law is there. There were two previous cases with, which was the Bob Marshall Alliance versus Watt, which was farther south on the front, and the Connor v. Burford decision in the Flathead, that both judges ruled that the leases were illegal because they were leased with a perfunctory EA, a cookie-cutter EA. And that's basically the way these leases happened. They were all that way during the Reagan administration when the whole front was leased. And when the judge ruled against us on the Solonex case, he did not address the legality of those leases. He of the Moncrief lease and the Solonex lease. And his decision was totally based on the fact that the government kept the oil company waiting for 30-something years, and so I firmly believe that if that case goes before a panel of judges, not a single judge, but before a panel of judges, which it's supposed to do, that they will rule in our favor because that court has, I guess, is split right down the middle as far as conservatives and liberals and, pro-environment judges and anti-environment judges. I am alarmed by things that have happened in the Trump administration, with William Perry Penley and I forget his name. And Bernhardt, I mean, talk about putting the fox in charge of the hen house. And let's see, something else. What else did you ask me? I forgot.
Well, what are your thoughts on about full protection of the badger? Obviously, given that there are cultural sensitivities.
I believe that the tribe should have co-management. I think it's only right. Their spiritual connection with it has not been traditionally has not been addressed by the agencies, and I'm not saying that they should have unfettered management of the Badger Two Medicine, but I think it's a good deal if they have a strong role, a strong role with oversight, and that's the key is oversight. I often say, that the thing it's fine if things are on paper, and in legislation, but the next step is making sure everybody follows the rules, because like right now we have no motorized vehicle access, and yet it's obvious that people are accessing it. It's not rampant, but if you walk on the landscape, you can see signs of it, So, anyway.
So, Lou, as a teacher, you're increasingly finding yourself imparting the lessons you've learned to younger generations, including students with groups like the Wild Rockies Institute. Yeah. What is your main message to them?
My main message to them, and I think this is why they keep asking me to talk to them, I think if there's any group that shows what can happen with grassroots advocacy, it's our group, and what I want to what I want to impress on these kids is that the process can work if you believe it can work and if you're persistent at it, because these kids come to me and it's very inspirational for me to talk to them because it gives me hope that there is a future for this country, and that there are people that think beyond the box, and sometimes, they ask me some pretty tough questions, but it shows that they're thinking and processing it, and they're driven to do something about it, but they don't know what direction they can go, so I want them to believe that they can find. I always tell them, find what you're good at. Don't do the things you're not good at because chances are you're going to be ineffective. But find the things that you are good at, which was what I always told my students, and go for the gusto with it. If you're a good artist or if you're a good writer or if you're a good mechanic, go with those things, and because that's what happened to me, It's like I didn't know that I'm a total schmaltz, and because I'm gay, I always thought that was a bad thing, that because I was supposed to be a man and be tough and be a brick, and I found that the fact that I'm sensitive and that I get tears in my eyes when I talk about things that are passionate to me is not something that's bad and not something to be ashamed of. It's something that moves people, and that I can take those things and make them work for the environment, and that's what everybody needs to do is find what they're good at and do the most you can with it, And sometimes it's hard to find the correct path, It's always difficult for me, It's always difficult for me to find to figure out, how strident I should be and how sometimes I have to give some things a pass in order to accomplish the greater good. It's always. You've been involved too. It's always a difficult thing, to figure it out. But first and foremost, I want them to know that they can make a difference. Because I had no idea that I could way back then. So.
I love this bit that you wrote in a piece that I'd like to share. You said, when it all comes down to it, it's really not about me or you. It's about all the other creatures of the earth and their right to have the wild places to carry out their lives in the way they've evolved to live.
Yeah.
Can you expand on this?
Well, it's very disturbing for all of us, I'm sure. I'm sure you're in the same boat, to see the assault that's happening on this planet. I was just reading this thing or hearing this thing about Jimmy Carter, and the fact that when he was born, since was born, he's 90, I forget, 90, in his mid-90s. And since he was born, the world population is 4 times as big as it was back then,
Yeah.
And the stressful thing to me is that we've, on one hand, we've learned a lot. We're not shooting predators. We're not equating good animals and bad animals and shooting predators on sight. And we're not, it's like when I was a kid, you could shoot hawks and owls and anything like that on sight. And we've learned that the wolf, many of us have learned that the wolf and the grizzly have places in the ecosystem, and even more than that, we learned a lot scientifically. But it's all being negated by the overpopulation of this world, and also by what we're doing in climate change, and it's frustrating to me to see that that the future, I don't see. I just worry that enough people are going to get a clue and change it all, and make real attempts to deal with population and climate change. Because as far as I'm concerned, every single issue, environmental issue, boils down to that.
Mm-hmm.
If all of us eat the right things and conserve the right things and do everything we can to minimize our impact on the earth, it will still not come to any good until we get a handle on the overpopulation of this earth. And I feel, I equate that. I bring that back to the feeling about these creatures, that it's not okay for us, in the name of progress or in the name of man, to always say, well, these creatures have to step back and deal with us, and go out of existence because it's all about us. And to me, it's not about me. It's like I'm 74 years old. Do you think I could climb and hike to any place in the Badger I want these days? But it doesn't matter to me, I mean, there's got lots of places in Glacier and lots of places in the Badger I'm never going to see. But is it right for me, just because of my, the short time that I'm on this earth, is it right for me to not to impact all of these creatures and permanently impact the land and the landscape because of me, just me? It's and I don't know how else to express it,
Yeah.
Because it's not all about me. How could it be? Why would it be?
Yeah, the antithesis, I think, of the current culture is a sense of humility, which is what you're articulating, and that it isn't about me.
I guess so, and even if I was bound, and, even if I live to 95 and I'll be bound to a wheelchair, I'm still going to advocate for wild places, because it's not about that at all. It's not about my ability to recreate, for God's sake, So.
Well, speaking of your age, Lou, you described earlier today how much you learned from the old guard, people like Bill Cunningham and Chuck Jonkel, and now you're part of the old guard.
I know.
How do you hope the new guard
That's scary.
I know, me too. How do you hope the new guard will orient to the challenges?
Say that again.
How do you hope the new guard will orient to the challenges we're leaving behind?
Well, I hope that they'll again keep in mind the same mantra that I have, that I just told you about. That it won't just be about them and about their recreation, but about a value system that revolves around wild things and wild places. I mean, I'm sitting right here looking up at Glacier in my front window here, and just the fact that I know there are mountain sheep at the top of that ridge, and there could be a wolf pack just over the ridge on the left side is really powerful and inspiring to me, and I hope that people that the new guard can continue to have that philosophy, that it's not just about them recreating, that it's about the planet and the land, and keeping it the way it is. I mean, I feel the thing I feel too is, I know as a biologist that, somehow this planet is not going to die completely. It's some form that it's going to exist in somehow, but is it the form that we really want it to exist in eventually, So.
Well, Lou, I can't thank you enough. This has been wonderful. So thank you, Lou. This is Louisa Wilcox with Lou Bruno and Grizzly Times. Thank you.